would like to discuss the magical law of equilibrium. The law of equilibrium. I've heard this called the law of neutralization before, and I learned it as the law of equilibrium. I think neutralization makes it sound like we are getting rid of something, whereas equilibrium is a little bit more clear about what we're doing when we apply the law. So let's just go over some of the basic Hermetic principles, as they're called these days. There is a book called The Kybalion that became very popular throughout the 20th century, and it's still popular today. And it's loosely based on the writings of the Hermetica. And some of the ways that it has codified the Hermetic teachings is actually quite valuable, but it's not technically part of the Hermetica itself, even though people say it is. It's not. It's more of a new thought book that's based on Hermetic teachings, and so it's a good book. It's a good book. And a lot of times when I talk about the Hermetic teachings, people assume I'm talking about the Kybalion because that's the only way that they've been exposed to Hermetics. But the Hermetica are a very ancient series of texts. Some of them are probably contemporary writings of where the New Testament came from about that same time, and some of them are a little bit older. Most of the Hermetica, even though it's been attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, it really was a series of scholars and scribes that were writing these things. And they were written primarily for a Greek audience regarding ancient Egyptian religion. So there was definitely a crossover between Egypt and Greece in those writings. They are very opaque, sometimes extremely challenging to get through, but they're worth the effort. They are definitely worth the effort. The Kybalion is a distillation of a lot of those teachings, but it's not a substitute for the teaching. So I just want to get that out there because I get this a lot of people that think that they're, very learned in Hermetica because they've read the Kybalion. And it's a nice book. It's a wonderful book, but it's not technically the Hermetica. So you got to get through some of the more challenging texts. Having said that, Hermes does talk about some of the laws that are outlined in the Kybalion, and let's go over a few of them so I can explain to you about this law of equilibrium. So the law of polarity is very similar to the law of magnetism, and it's used in electricity, obviously. When we deal with electricity, there's positive and negative poles. It talks about the law of polarity is in operation in all manifest phenomena. So everywhere that we exist in this world, we are experiencing some aspect of the law of polarity. So there's a positive and a negative pole on every single thing that we do. And the law of rhythm, talked about in the Kybalion, is definitely something that is spoken of not necessarily by that name, but a lot throughout the Hermetic writings. And this is dealing with the idea of energy moving back and forth between the two poles rhythmically. And so a lot of what we experience as life here in this three-dimensional universe has to do with the law of polarity and the law of rhythm interacting with one another. And what tends to happen in regards to how we manifest things in our lives is that when something good happens, then we expect something bad to happen because we expect that rhythm between what we consider to be positive and negative. And an actual battery, positive and negative, they don't mean good and bad. They just are talking about poles on the battery. They're talking more about the principle of gender, more of a masculine and feminine thing. Whereas in our lives, when we go back and forth between poles, oftentimes we are going back and forth between pain and pleasure, light and dark, happy and sad, love and hate. So there are always polarities that we are experiencing. So let's go about just for a moment and look at some of the polarities that we do experience. When we are experiencing something to do with money, we are sitting, many of us, on the polarity of poverty, prosperity. That's a polarity that we establish, poverty, prosperity. When we are dealing with love affairs, we're dealing with love and hate, or we're dealing with love and loneliness for some of us, companionship loneliness, back and forth. Oftentimes we go through the principle of rhythm between two polarities in any topic that we are experiencing. And as human beings, we don't really seem to have free will in regards to how we interact with these poles. This law of rhythm seems to have a life of its own, going back and forth between love and hate, happy, sad, rich, poor. In our lives, it seems like we have a mental baseline. The polarity can't go any lower on a specific level in regards to, let's say, the polarity of poverty, prosperity. You're not going to go below a certain level usually, but you're also not going to go higher than a certain level. And so you tend to dance back and forth. And the same thing goes in relationships. A lot of times we have, loneliness, companionship as maybe a polarity that we've established. And we go back and forth. Pleasure and pain. A lot of us have tolerance of pain. So we don't have, we have maybe a baseline of a type of amount of pain that we're willing to tolerate. And then we have an upper level of pleasure that we're willing to tolerate. And then we go back and forth, rhythmically between the two. The rhythmic cycles can last sometimes years, sometimes they can last seconds or moments. But it doesn't matter because the laws of polarity and rhythm are in effect. Now, we don't understand how much free will we actually have because it seems as though we have no free will in regards to the laws. It seems like we are complete victims as to where that law of polarity and rhythm takes us. It seems like no matter what we do, we have this and that polarity, and we go back and forth. It seems like we are victims of those two laws, polarity and rhythm. There are many of the magical laws that seem dormant until we activate them. Similar to how the laws of electricity are always active, but until somebody actually harnesses them, they're not really usable, other than the way that electricity happens naturally, for life forms and things like that. But as far as harnessing them for our good, that takes effort. That takes conscious effort, that we have to actually activate those laws. We actually have to learn them, and we have to mobilize our resources in order that those laws become usable for us. And the same thing goes with magical laws. The law of equilibrium is there always, but it has to be activated. And this is how it works. When you're going back and forth in a polarity, visualize it for a moment like a pendulum. Now, just think of a pendulum of a clock. This is just a visual, okay? It's not necessarily what's happening, but just bear with me and see that pendulum is swinging back and forth between two poles. And that's our experience within any polarity. We're going back and forth. Now, some of us have very wide polarities, and some of us have more narrow polarities. Either way, our pendulum is swinging back and forth. But imagine what would happen if you started to climb up the pendulum. Notice how the swing becomes less profound the higher up the pendulum you go. And once you get to the point at which that pendulum is attached, there is seemingly, even though you're on the pendulum, you don't have any sense of rhythm. You don't have any sense of back and forth. It's all happening beneath you. You can look down and see it. You can look down from the point of view of where the pendulum is attached and see a very wide swing beneath you, but you're not experiencing that swing when you are up on that top of the pendulum. And so that's a very good visual for us to understand how we can still, within that law of polarity and within that law of rhythm, have a sense of equilibrium so that we're not victimized. We don't feel like we are being thrown back and forth between two polarities any longer. And the way we do that is by climbing up the pendulum until we get to its pinnacle. So that is a way that we can visualize how the law of equilibrium can be invoked. When we invoke the law of equilibrium, we are simply rising above what's going on in the baser part of the law of rhythm. The lower you go, in vibration in the law of rhythm, the wider the swing you're going to get. And the higher in vibration you travel within that law of rhythm, the less of a back and forth rhythm you get. As we rise in vibration in any situation, we, for all intents and purposes, have equilibrated ourselves to the effects of polarity and rhythm, even though they are still happening, but we don't become their victims. We are actually above the wide swings. And this is a very important thing to understand, because as people who are learning how to have more mastery in our lives, become more adept in our magic, we have to understand that any place that we feel victimized by the world is simply a place we have yet to find a raising of our vibration so that we can rise higher and higher on whatever pendulum is swinging in our lives. So if you want to, you can take a look at some areas that you tend to have problems in your life. First thing that you do is look at the situation. Let's say you have problems with employment. Let's say you have a hard time keeping a job. First, you look at the problem itself and ask, well, what is the polarity? What is the polarity there? Well, the polarity is between employment and unemployment, right? The polarity there is between positive and negative employment. And so if you tend to lose and gain jobs, then you are at the bottom of that pendulum going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between that polarity. And so your job is not to try to change the law of rhythm or to change the law of polarity, because that can't be done. Accept that that's where you are and rise higher and higher and higher on that pendulum so that you no longer are experiencing the varying degrees of polarity any longer. You're no longer experiencing those wide shifts in rhythm between positive and negative. You are becoming more equilibrated. And so the way that you might do that is first by invoking the law of equilibrium. And you can just say, I invoke the divine law of equilibrium in this situation. My vibrations are rising higher and higher. And just by saying that, you're starting to tell your deep mind what it is that you want. And you sit and you take a moment and you close your eyes and you consider what the polarity is. You consider the feeling of going back and forth between two poles, and you start to raise your vibrations higher and higher and higher. We employ a 3-step formula. And you'll recognize this formula because it's a very common formula in most every kind of magic. But in this particular case, we're using it for the purpose of invoking the law of equilibrium. First thing you do is relax your body completely. My feet are relaxed. My legs are relaxed. My hips are relaxed. My abdomen's relaxed. My back's relaxed. My chest is relaxed. My shoulders are relaxed, my arms are relaxed, my hands are relaxed, my throat is relaxed, my neck is relaxed, my face is relaxed, my jaw is relaxed, my tongue is relaxed, my eyes are relaxed, my scalp is relaxed, my whole body is relaxed. As I breathe deeply, I let go of all tension and anything I do not want in my body, and I'm perfectly relaxed and at peace. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to start to experience and what I say conjure the emotional state that you desire. Now, in regards to your job, for this particular one, for having that equilibrium within employment, you start to feel like, well, what would it feel like if I was always gainfully employed? How would I feel emotionally if I always had enough money? How would I feel if I had a long-term job where I had benefits and I had a track record and history and I was in good standing with my boss and I was in good standing with the company that I work? How would that feel? What would the emotion feel like? And you start to conjure that emotion. And then the third step is that you start to see pictures, visualize pictures of yourself being, doing, and having all of that. Seeing yourself gainfully employed, seeing yourself being happy with your job, seeing yourself going and depositing your paychecks into the bank or being auto-deposited into your bank. Seeing yourself going to the Christmas parties and seeing yourself doing all of the things that you would really love to see yourself doing in regards to having gainful long-term employment. That's that 3-step formula: relaxation, conjuring the right emotion according to what it is that you desire, and seeing the accompanying visuals that prove to your deep mind that this is happening. And notice what's happening as you do that, especially since you've already invoked the divine law of equilibrium before you started it. You have, because of doing that, you have already started to raise your vibrations higher and higher. And as you keep that up and you do that every night, you'll notice that you no longer are switching so far back and forth between two poles. And as you get employed and as you get your next job, you're going to be more inclined to keep that job and only be attracted and magnetized towards jobs that are long-term jobs and things that are going to stay with you. If you're going back and forth between getting along and having a fight with your spouse or your mate, that's a polarity. So the first thing, what do? First thing you do is look at the situation and you say, well, what is the polarity that I'm establishing here? What polarity is being established? It's the polarity between peace and conflict. And so I now call upon the divine law of equilibrium in this situation, and I am raising my vibrations. And then you put in that 3-step formula. You relax your body completely. And then you start to conjure the emotions that you would have if you were always in a state of peace with your mate. And any kind of conflict got easily resolved. And you saw each other's point of view. And you saw the other side of the story. And you had cooperation at all times. You start to visualize those things as well. You start to have a mental loop of you always coming together and having cooperation with your mate. You have a symbol that symbolizes that to your deep mind, and you see that visual again and again and again to prove to your deep mind that this is happening. And as you do those 3 things together, you don't have to necessarily always do them in sequence. Sometimes the visual will help to conjure the emotions, and sometimes the emotions will help to conjure the visual. And if you notice tension coming up, then you have to go back and relax. So you have those 3 things happening in consort. And as you do that, you notice that you're rising up that pendulum and you're no longer having those swings as much. And as you keep that up daily, and just like any spell, you keep it up until you have a sense of certainty and peace that it's working, and you'll feel it click. And once you feel it click, you can stop doing the castings of the spell. You can stop doing the actual formula. But you'll notice that doing that by invoking the law of equilibrium and working with this magical formula, that your relationship stops having those major swings back and forth, and you start having equilibrium within the relationship. Now, I'd like to be very clear that we're not circumventing natural law when we do that. We are instead experiencing the law on a higher level. The higher always overcomes the lower. That's how magic works. That's how life works. It's not that the lower is bad and the higher is good. It's just that the higher is closer to truth than the lower. That's why the dense vibrations of shadow versus the intense high vibrations of light's always going to overcome shadow if it's shined directly onto the shadow. It's not that shadow's bad. It's not that light is good. It's just that light is closer to the truth and shadow is not. And so sometimes with polarity, when we go back and forth, where we are having a dance between 2 illusions, and when we invoke the law of equilibrium, we are rising above the apparent illusion. We are experiencing closer to the truth. Another way you can see the law of equilibrium rather than as a pendulum, you know how sometimes when you're experiencing turbulence in a flight, the pilot has to go higher to go above the turbulence? And that's what we're doing. When you're experiencing turbulence in your life, it's usually a very rapid dance, rhythmic dance between poles, between a polarity. And so if you can rise higher in vibrations, that dance is then happening beneath you, and you're no longer subject to that dance. You're no longer subject to that turbulence. So it's another way that you could possibly think of that is rising above the turbulence. All major polarity swings are turbulent. And that's why when they say whatever goes up must come down. Well, whatever goes up must come down unless you are higher in consciousness. The higher you go in consciousness, that polarity you don't experience that polarity as up, down, up, down, up, down. You don't experience it like that anymore. You experience it more closer to the truth. And that is 2 sides of the same thing, where the turbulence that is involved with the dance between the 2 is no longer affecting you. let's take one more example. Let's say money. That's one that people come to me with almost every single day. So let's say that you are constantly having financial problems. Well, first of all, you have to establish in your mind what is the polarity that you have established first. So let's say that the polarity is prosperity, poverty. That's the polarity that you've established here. And so that what you're doing is you're having a dance between positive and negative, between prosperity and poverty. Every time you get a little bit of money, it always seems to go. And then you get a little bit of money and it always seems to go. And it's up and down, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it's very turbulent and very stressful. And so what you do is you first, now that you've established what the polarity is, you recognize that I'm experiencing the bottom of the pendulum if it's turbulent. Therefore, I call upon the divine law of equilibrium. I am now rising in vibration in regards to this polarity. Then you just establish your formula. You completely relax your body, mind, and then you start to conjure the emotions. How would that feel if you always had enough money to pay your bills? If you always had enough money to do what you wanted to do when you wanted to do it? How would it feel if you had money in the bank and you knew that you were okay with, for your retirement? And how would it feel? What would those emotions feel like? Just conjure them. Just actually conjure them. This is you as a magician, as a witch. This is your greatest power, is conjuring feeling, because that's the beginning. That's the fountainhead of all manifestation, is conjuring a feeling. And then conjure the visuals that go along with those feelings. What are some images? You don't have to have everything mapped out for yourself. Just have a little loop in your mind of what would prove to you that you had enough money, that you had more than enough money to be happy. Maybe you have a visual of you looking at your bank balance and smiling, or something like that, so that you have this visual that you can loop again and again and again to prove to your deep mind that money's great, that the money, you're very, very at peace with money, and that your prosperity is equilibrated. And then that's how you rise up that pendulum, so that you're no longer experiencing those vast swings back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And you're now having this experience of prosperity as it really exists in truth, rather than this illusion of prosperity where it's a dance between having and not having, having and not having. So that's how that law of equilibrium works, and I recommend that you experiment with it. It's really fascinating, and you can get some wonderful results almost immediately just by considering it and by putting it into practice. Thank you so much for spending a little time with me today. I so appreciate you. Until next time, blessed be.